Hello, everyone. My name is Zofia, and I'm a PhD student at the Taiwan National Chengchi University. Today, I'm going to present to you an outcome of a few months of a topic that was possessing my mind. And it's called the sex balance, Neidan self-cultivation in the light of feminist philosophy. As we can see, not moving. Oh, yes. Okay. As we can see, my research is centered around three main spheres of analysis. One is philosophy, one is feminism, and the next one is Neidan. For Neidan, I understand it's the tradition connected to the religious Daoist tradition. What I mean by religious Daoist, of course, I don't like this term because for me, Daoist tradition shouldn't be divided into philosophical and religious Daoism when it comes to theoretical background. Well, maybe it's more like historical division, but anyway, I'm going to always say about Daoist tradition or saying religious Daoist, I mean in a historical way. So those three aspects, and around those three aspects, I found interesting topics that came out through the analysis, and I will be trying to work around them for the next 90 minutes. So the contents I divided into 6 parts, and I hope I can include all of them in this short talk. Quite a lot, but we need to start first from the historical background when it comes to feminist philosophy. This is my point of departure. Feminist philosophy actually is something that came out in the second half of the 20th century, inspired by Simone de Beauvoir's treatise Second Sex, published in 1949, and the second wave of feminism, which was the woman liberation movement in the 60s and 80s. We can define feminist philosophy as an investigation that gives voices to women's experiences and treats them as philosophically significant in a non-sexist manner while maintaining a healthy skepticism about any easily provided generalization. So we can see on the right the most important ideas that were surrounded around the second wave feminism and at the time feminist philosophy. At the beginning, philosophy and feminism had some tensions and controversies, but at the end they came into understanding that they can contribute to each other, and those contributes, you can see it on the slide. I won't discuss them in details right now. But the problem is that at some point feminist philosophy reached a wall. That was due to the lack of global perspective, because it was had some kind of restricted inclusiveness. It created an emancipation theory formed only for Euro-American white middle-class women. That is why later third wave of feminism has arisen and tried to self-criticize the theory proposed by the early feminist philosophers and ask for more for liberation and equality for all women of different forms of life. So it put a huge critique on the one woman standpoint and tried to abolish the universal feminist reality. So we can see the ideas that were the main topics around which they were discussing a little bit changed, because aside equality, gender, race, we have class, individualism, intersectionality, and multiculturalism. Later on, in the fourth wave, inspired by the fourth wave of feminism, we have another part of topics which were gradual continuation of the previous ones, maybe in a bigger impact on the local social life and global culture to culture section. And it was the beginning of so-called transcultural or comparative feminist philosophy. So before the 21st century, Western feminists and philosophy were a bit immune to the influence of non-Western philosophical traditions. And in the last decade, we can already see that this is it began a shift, that we have transcultural approaches to feminist philosophy, mostly in the Eastern traditions from Chinese, Indian, and Japanese Buddhism, as well as Confucianism and philosophical Daoism. Still, the positive assessment of Daoist religion in the context of sex, gender, and feminism remains marginal. So this is my aim of this presentation of my future paper, I hope so, to prove that Daoist religion, especially its notion of inner self-cultivation aimed at progressive refinement of the body presented in the form of early internal alchemy, Neidan, while analyzed with the help of philosophical and feminist methods, can be seen as a different and unique way to liberate women from confusion created by sex and gender differentiations. So this is the way that I want to put it into dialogue: philosophy, feminism, and Neidan, and see how it actually works out for the idea of sex, gender, and equality. My main focus points are here four. So we have early days Daoist Neidan self-cultivation in Tang, Song, China, 12th century, which was concerned about the equal goal, equal treatment, yet different cultivation methods for men and women. The next one is the yin-yang correlative thinking and Daoist cosmo-ontology influencing human nature, mind, and body. Of course, the most important one is the position of women and men in the Tang Song Confucian society. And at the end, this is the question that the life of self-cultivation in Daoist circles as gender abolishment and sex transformation visit a new idea of equality. First of all, we need a little bit of concept definition of some concepts. The differentiation between sex and gender came up in the 1960s. What we call sex is biological facticity and an identity of being female or male that we receive at birth. It is strictly connected with the way our body looks, functions, and operates. On the other hand, gender is a cultural and social interpretation or emplacement of this natural facticity, including models of behavior and social roles stereotypically related to women and men, something that we can also call feminine and masculine traits. So on one side, we have identity given at birth, and on the other one, we have identity forced in life, so natural and artificial. As we can see, they are kind of separate ideas, but they are also very coextensive. And some feminists say that a person can become a woman, so sex and gender do not necessarily need to match. More radical approach is saying that sex and gender both are human constructed notions. Both are artificial and gender is performative. This is made by Judith Butler. When it comes to Daoist idea of sex and gender, there's actually no clear distinction in the classical text. Everything was hurled into notion of xing, which itself is very ambiguous. We can call it human nature, but it's not only it has got a broader spectrum of meaning. So according to the Daoist tradition, everyone had their xing, just like everyone had their yin. And those notions were connected with the fact of being female or male, feminine or masculine. So it is hard to establish if xing and yin are gender constructs only. But according to the Daoist view, everything that Confucian society was ascribing to a woman or man was an illusion. And in order to reach their innate xing or innate yin, they needed to abolish norms that compelled them to act in gendering ways. For Neidan especially, this was not enough. Man and woman body construction, their sex, needed to be changed and transgressed. Therefore, the Neidan practice focused on the sex of its practitioners, not on the gender, on their biological and not social identity, because one's body and mind was the key to transcendence and not their social standing, status, or wealth. When it comes to equality, this notion can be defined as a group of different objects, persons, processes, or circumstances that have the same qualities in at least one respect, but not all respects. But this idea is still very controversial, and there are different continuation of understanding how we should see equality. We have liberal feminists and different feminists. The liberal or equality ones see principle or perfect equality and demand gender sameness, where no power or privilege is given to a person only because their sex or gender make them member of a specific group. This is how they see that men and women are anatomically different, but they have the same rational capacities. Different feminists, they are against the vision of equality on male terms, as they call it, because for them, gender neutrality within society can still cause harm, because female perspective and experience is unique and must be preserved just like the male perspective. So now we can move on to the Confucian society in the Tang Song China, where we put our woman, like the cultivation, the woman cultivating, the person who cultivates Neidan was a woman. So we can see that since the Han Dynasty, Confucianism took over the political stage and influenced people's social and family life in a number of ways. Both men and women were bound strict to moral norms and exemplary conducts, along with the Sangang Wuchang. So we can see on the picture here on the right that they were surrounded by 5 important Confucian virtues and 3 relations. For the brevity, I used Chinese. I'm so sorry for those who don't understand. There were more restrictions made on women than on men that created a gender gap in the domains of life. So men were supposed to perform in the public sphere, when the women were close in their households and taking care of the family. And women were first to live a hierarchical patriarchy and played the role of filial daughters, 贤女, and virtuous wives and good mothers, 贤妻良母. So they could only theoretically become a noble person. So there are some ideas that could have been possible for women to become Junzi, but there were no evidence, textual evidence at least. And in the end, men and women were different in the Confucian tradition. There was always some kind of difference between them. On the other side, we have a Daoist response to it. Daoist tradition, connection of Daoist philosophy and religion, supported feminine traits and was open to the power of the feminine. We can see it in the Tao Te Ching. And the Daoist religious believer also praised the female gods and immortals. But due to the insufficient political influence and other socio-historical reasons, Daoists did not create a gender equality among Chinese men and women of all social backgrounds. But it did provide extraordinary opportunities for some women. Especially within the 8th and 12th century, there were 2 ways for women from a middle and higher society to escape the struggles of her everyday life under male domination. The direct one was through priesthood or monastery life. There were many monasteries built at the Tang Dynasty, also for women. And the indirect was being a wife of a Daoist master. Daoist masters were actually connected with the Neidan practice at the time. They were like kind of almost every Daoist master was a Neidan master. So in both cases, women were equal to men, could cultivate their xing and min, could actually become a better person, a realized being, even if the female cultivation methods were different than the male ones. So when it comes to Neidan at the time, it was associated with the Daoist religion and just started to consolidate. And its popularity was growing slowly, mostly in male circles of rich gentry. Even if the female practitioners were not as numerous as the male ones, Neidan tradition did not omit them. But the detailed descriptions of practice for women were very hard to find due to the reduced demand, because the social restrictions imposed on women by the patriarchal tradition made it almost impossible for them to familiarize with such practice. And due to the reduced channels of communication, the practical knowledge was only given from the master to apprentice directly. But anyway, those female practitioners, those practitioners that could actually cultivate themselves, they had an opportunity to abolish their gendered roles in society and could achieve something which we can call a feminist consciousness. So understanding of what a woman is and where she is in the light of what she's not yet. This brings us to the idea of the whole cultivation, which is connected very strongly with the ontology, cosmontology of I Ching and Daoist sources. So overall, Daoist self-cultivation was always aiming at the same idea, the way to become a perfect person, Zhiren, or a fully accomplished being, Zhenren, or immortal, Xianren. This change in one's being was a movement of coming back to the way we originally were formed. In other words, it was a reversion, Fan, of the cosmogonical process described in the Book of Changes and Tao Te Ching. It was also coming back, Huan, from multiplicity to the state before the creation of life, to the unity. And there were various immortality practices, Xian Shu, nurtured by the Daoist tradition, but the only inner alchemy, Neidan, that emerged at the 8th century developed into a complex, long-lasting system. So Neidan practitioners believe that the human body and cosmos correspond to each other. We have microcosm and macrocosm and microcosm. And both of them are governed by the same principles. That is why, on the basis of those principles, and while using the alchemical language from the White Dan, the chemical way of alchemy, they created a set of practices aiming at control of free energies in the body, Jing Qi Shen, refining them and merging into one substance, the so-called seed of immortality, Neidan. This is a very short description of Neidan because I don't have time to describe it more in details. Here we have a graph, once again, put in Chinese for brevity because it looks better than putting it in English. So we can see this top-down process from I Ching and Dao De Jing, the creation of the cosmos from 1 into 2 into more, into multiplicity and 10,000 beings. And then we have the reverse bottom-up process of Neidan. And one thing is important to see here, that from the unity first, we had the unity separated first into 2, yin and yang. And this is very important. This is called the yin-yang correlation theory, which is said that from the pre-celestial domain, Xiantian, we have the Dao or Taiji, and this is the yin and yang harmonized and assimilated into one entity. In the post-celestial domain, we have yin and yang separated, and those are the very distinct but also correlative, coextensive, and complementing forces. They cannot exist separately, and they stand on the same ontological level. This is very important. So they are the main characteristics of all beings, and they are strongly context-dependent. Why they are context-dependent? Why is it important? This is very important for the cultivation process. So the internal alchemy practitioners believe that the great Tao does not differentiate between man and woman. So both man and woman were created through the gradual process of separation from unity, both were destined to die. Both man and woman were a mixture of yin and yang in the different ways, different proportions. Yin within yang was men, and woman was yang within yin. Both men and women had xing and yin that needed to be cultivated. There was a cultivation of xing shuangxiu for the Neidan tradition. And both men and women had free vital energies in their bodies that were the ingredients for the elixir of immortality. Both men and women could go back to primordial unity too by cautiously gaining energies and reverting the course of creation. So there were, however, differences between the male and female processes. Stemming mostly first from the different cosmological origins or the innate nature in the disposition, which was called pingheng of man and woman. It was caused by those variant amounts of yin and yang in their bodies. And those variant amounts of yin and bodies created different structure, physical structure, xingbie, with different features. So therefore, it was important to transform those imbalanced temporary bodies, more yin within yang and yang within yin, so that they would not provoke a gender differentiation anymore. This is a very long quote about how those differences were described. So right now I don't have time, I believe, to talk about it in details, but it was described like very nicely, the woman's and men construction and the way that they are, the yin and yang in their bodies were put in a different use, you can say. So when it comes to ideal practice, there were the cosmo-ontological and structural differences between men and women were calling for the different practice, which was called Gongfu and was divided into Minggong and Xinggong. Minggong was the one that was concerned with the transformation of the body, and at the level of this practice was where the biggest difference between men and women. And this was connected with the first stage, which you can see there below on the graphs. The first stage of the Minggong was the changing Jing into Qi for men and changing Xue into Qi for women. So for men, the primary substance was Jing, which was semen, and for women it was blood, Xue. The rest of the practice was the same for both. So at the first level of the Minggong, of the Mi practice, was the different substance, and for women it was blood. Why? Because blood was the essential element of the female body. It kept the youth and vitality, and that woman needed to collect the blood inside her body so that she could become, to transcend, so that she could transcend. This implied a serious psychosomatic transformation, which woman was supposed to behead the red dragon. Red dragon was the menses, Zhan Shilong. She needed to stop her menses and flatten her breasts so that they would lose the function of producing milk. Like milk was also seen as a way of, as a different substance, as a different transformation of blood. So this could be achieved by a series of breathing exercises, internal visualizations, self-massages, mental concentration, and suppression of emotions. But actually, this change looked very drastic. But when it comes to men, they also needed to go through very huge change. first of all, humanization, visualization, briefing techniques, they needed to maintain Jing in their bodies and stop any sexual desires. This resulted in a retraction of their genitals. On the other hand, the process of Neidan is a metaphorical gestation. We are producing the immortal substance, right? So this is compared to the way that we are producing a newborn as a child. So men biologically did not have a chance to experience something like this. It is also an action without movement, something which we could describe more in the term of yin, stillness, and that kind of characteristics. So that's why for men it took longer than for women to achieve the goal, maybe like 10 years for men, 3 years for women. So at the end, we can see that there is a shift from distorted self to realized self, where distorted self is the sex differentiation into female and male, and their gender connected with their social standing, femininity, masculinity. Both of them needed to be eradicated. And at the end, we achieved something which we can call an androgynous body and realized mind, something that is not put into sex gender concepts. So coming to the conclusions, we can say that although the ontocosmological and bodily structural diversities between sexes created a rift between male and female Neidan techniques, the whole cultivation process was not gendered. The bodily differentiation was understood in a strictly practical manner, and sex-tailored methods were means for an efficient way to harmonize yin and yang. Neidan, in a general sense, is a gender-liberating and sex-transcending practice. Undertaking Daoist self-cultivation practices, women were given the same opportunities as men and were treated with equal respect. Both men and women needed to undergo a psychosomatic transformation to rip out the root of all distinction, sex, and to be released from labels of masculinity and femininity, gender. So in the Daoist tradition, womanhood was not understood as inverse of or underside manhood, just like yin was not subordinated to yang. Neidan, by acknowledging biological differences between genders, did not want to impose any hierarchical order between them, but to prepare an appropriate and justly tailored technique by reckoning and embracing them. This idea of equality somehow is very similar to the beliefs ascribed to different feminists, but it's a more creative approach. So we can say that Daoism might be gene-oriented, but certainly is not genocentered. And it is for the best, I believe, because the ideal is to keep harmony between both opposites. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.